Welcome. So, hello, I'm Dr. Rebecca Jorgensen. Welcome to Talk Time. And I'm so happy to have my guest here, Dr. Ian Kerner, with me today. We're talking about sex. Anything about sex, I think, is what we're talking about today. So welcome, Ian. Let me just tell, before we really get rolling, let me tell our guests a little bit about you and where you're from. You're in New York, and you have a great amount of writing that you've done, a lot of books. You're a New York Times Best Selling Author, which is really fantastic and exciting, with your really popular book that I hope we'll talk some about, She Comes First. You've been on all kinds of media shows, the Today Show, the Dr. Oz Show. So you're internationally known as an expert in the field of sex therapy. You work with couples and individuals. I'm just so happy to have you here with us.
My pleasure. I'm an expert everywhere except in my own home. So,
well, I don't know. You know, your book defies you by saying that just a little bit. It would say that you know something about how to apply sex at home.
Yeah. I try.
So, yes, well, it's such an important thing in a relationship.
Yeah, like everyone else, it's a struggle to make time and to work against stress and kids and financial stuff and work, and to just really carve out that quality time for intimacy. Sometimes I have to go read my own work to remind myself of what I need to do.
Yeah. Oh, that's great, right? Because as couple therapists, we always are watchful of our own relationships. And I think when our relationships are having trouble, that's one of the most difficult things for us, to be couple experts and then, you know, need some of our own spice sometimes.
Yeah, no, I think that was one of the reasons I was so prolific for a period of time, was because I was really working on so many issues. I wrote a book called Love in the Time of Colic, all about how to, deal with new babies and the change in the diet and the change in the sex life. And I was figuring it out myself.
Yeah, well, you figured out a lot of things that you were able to put into print: the time of colic, the sex recharge. You kind of got this spectrum covered from dating, through regular couple marriage and long-term couple relationships. And then aging, because it's a lifespan problem for people to be able to have good, intimate sexual lives.
Yeah, but we remain sexual really until the day we die.
It reminds me, as you say that, about my mother, who's now deceased, but my father died before she did, and she started dating for about 7 years, I guess, after he died. She started dating again, and she totally acted like a teenager when she fell in love again. I thought, we just don't grow out of it,
I know. I had a similar experience. I watched my mom fall in love with somebody and become infatuated and make crazy, silly decisions and rush into things, and it was hard to believe this was my mom doing all of this, but it's also neat, I think, sometimes when older couples can sort of find love and intimacy, and sometimes without all the obstacles that younger couples face. And it's not unusual for older couples to have richer, more satisfying sex lives than much younger couples.
As surprising as that is, that's so true, isn't it? And that long-term relationships also seem to fare better older and longer term. So that's very interesting, and not really what we learn about in the media.
No, you'd be amazed. I mean, so I probably do about 25 hours of sex therapy a week with patients, and you would be surprised how many of my patients are, whether they're individuals or couples, are in their 20s.
I probably would be surprised about that.
Well, you wouldn't be surprised, actually, and probably nobody on this chat would be surprised, because we're all in the field. But I think we sort of expect that young people are young and sexy and raring to go and somehow should have it all figured out. But there's really such a dearth of quality education and communication.
Well, let's start about some of these topics that are difficult for people to discuss and for even therapists to discuss. And you put a lot of interesting material in your book, your best-selling book, She Comes First, and that female sexual desire, female orgasm, those are such difficult topics and so many to discuss, and problems in relationships. Can you go to that for just a little bit?
Go to what specifically, Rebecca? Just to sort of some of the topics of She Comes First.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I wrote She Comes First a while ago. It's you know, I sometimes get the opportunity to revise a book every now and then, and She Comes First is one of those books which it probably has a lot of imperfections in it 10 years later, but I kind of I don't really want to touch it because it sort of seems to be out there and working. It remains an Amazon bestseller and continues to remain popular. And you know, I think that there were a few things that made She Comes First an important book. One is that I kind of broke down the clinical wall and used a little bit of self-disclosure. I think it was kind of took some courage for me to begin the first chapter, Confessions of a Premature Ejaculator. And you know,
so much courage for you to do that.
It was hard.
It's so endearing at the same time, you know, to see the real person there.
Oh, well, then to have your mother read the book is like, wow, this is just too intense, you know. But you know, just on that topic, I mean, not a day goes by that I don't receive at least you know, 3 to 5 emails from men who are reading She Comes First, who are suffering from premature ejaculation, and that's after 10 years in print. And so, I mean, just being able, even though that wasn't the main point of the book, even being able to bring a sex issue like that sort of out of the shadows and into the spotlight was hugely important for me because, you know, we live in a culture where we have a pill for erectile disorder, and so as a result, it's pretty normalized, and we have commercials, and you know, men are fine popping Viagra, and women are fine keeping some in their drawer, but there isn't any cure or even effective way to really manage PE, and so as a result, it sort of has remained in the shadows. So that was one part of the book. The real reason I wrote the book, though, was because you know, time and time again, women were coming into my practice with the problem of not being able to orgasm during intercourse, and really sort of coming in with an almost an attitude of internal deficit. What's wrong with me? Am I broken? Why can't I have an orgasm during intercourse? And so I really just sort of wanted to say, hey, you know, it's not really you that's the problem. It's that we live in a culture of ill cliteracy. You know, and men know more about what's under the hood of a car than the hood of a clitoris, such as the woeful state of our sex education in America. And so I really wanted to educate men about female sexuality in a real, authentic, and companionable way. And I think that that's what has made the book so enduring, both for men and for women who are proud to say, hey, you should read this book. And you know, the other thing that's amazing is I get, every now and then I get an email or a thank you note from a mom or a dad who has given the book to their teenage son to help them become sort of respectful, clitorate members of society. And so, so I think that that's sort of where some of the enduring qualities of She Comes First are.
Yeah, it is very enduring that way. Well, it's endearing too, actually. That's what I was thinking. It's endearing that way. And so maybe for our listeners, you can tie together just a little bit the idea of PE to the idea that she comes first.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, you know, when you go back and you look at, and can I ask you, Rebecca, quickly, is our audience clinicians or lay people or a mix of everybody?
I think largely clinicians, but we may have some lay people who have joined us.
Okay, great. Well, I mean, I think, you know, when you go back to some of the early sex researchers like Masters and Johnson and some of the early models of human sexual response, there was a tendency to focus more on the similarities between the sexes rather than the differences when it came to human sexuality. And I think, you know, I think that there are some, really provocative, interesting differences between men and women. And, with women, certainly the arousal cycle can last much longer. I mean, for men, both from an evolutionary perspective, you wouldn't want the male ejaculation to take too long from an evolutionary perspective. I mean, you don't want like a saber-toothed tiger jumping in and interrupting. I mean, we have to propagate the human race, and so I think I think there's the evolutionary reason why men ejaculate quickly, and blood needs to flow into the genitals quickly and then flows out of the genitals quickly in men in order to enable that sort of explosive ejaculation. But in female sexual anatomy, blood flows more slowly into the genitals, so it takes a little longer to develop vasocongestion, which would be blood flow to the genitals, and myotonia, which would be tension throughout the body. And then the nice, lovely thing is that it also takes much longer for blood to flow out of the female genitals, hence the capacity for women to have multiple orgasms or to remain in a warmed state of arousal. But men, the average guy, what would be called the IELT, the intravaginal ejaculatory latency time, is really anywhere from about 2 to 7 minutes. And most men would exaggerate it, but it's probably even closer to 2 minutes than 7 minutes, regardless of what we see in porn. And so as a result, 80% of women may enjoy sex, but they don't necessarily reach orgasm if it's intercourse only. And so we have to think about intercourse plus, as I like to call it, or assisted intercourse, as it sometimes is called in sex therapy circles. But, that would be adding manual stimulation and oral stimulation and really embracing the idea of outer course as much as you would embrace intercourse. And so I guess I was really just trying to get men and women's arousal maps a little more synchronized, whether that leads to simultaneous orgasms, parallel orgasms, or serial orgasms, one after the other. And so that's a little bit about the relationship sort of between PE and she comes first. It's basically the idea of like, look, men, when you ejaculate, it's done. And it can happen quickly, and it's probably not going to happen for her if you're relying only on intercourse. Women also have this wonderful multi-orgasmic capacity, so show a little sexual courtesy, and she comes first.
Well, it's an amazing way to bridge those things, and really what a disservice has been done across time and still is being done with the idea that intercourse, that's kind of it, or that there is PE caused when there's not. It's just because men and women are different that way, and it's not really because it's a PE problem. It's an approach problem, right?
Well, yeah, and then also really the vagina is not the primary source of physiological arousal for women. It's really the vulva, and the vulva, most of the sensitive nerve endings that contribute to the female orgasm are located on the surface of the vulva. Even the G-spot is probably just the back roots of the clitoris. And so it's also getting guys sort of less focused on penetration and more focused on clitoral stimulation.
Yeah, that's really fantastic. So I just want to comment about how I know you've been doing this for a lot of years, but your level of comfort about being able to talk about all these sexual places and activities, and how do you remember when it wasn't so comfortable, and how did it become that way? Because I have lots of clinicians who maybe, and couples who really have a difficult time even having a conversation.
I sometimes forget how comfortable I am. I can be at Whole Foods and I get a call from a fact checker at Women's Health magazine, and I'm saying, no, clitoris, not vagina, vulva, and I'm shouting this out, and people are looking at me. Or, when my son was an infant and he was in the Bjorn, I used to do a lot of work with toys in Babeland, and I would pop in. And one time I noticed he had come out holding a vibrator that he was waving in his hand like a toy. And so, I'm definitely maybe have gotten a little overly familiar and overly used to it. But, you raise a really good point, which is, especially for clinicians, even for the couples who come in wanting to deal with a sex issue, it's amazing how when they actually come into the office, how quick they are to forget about it or not want to talk about it. And it is so easy to end up sort of colluding with the patient around the avoidance of talking about a sex issue. And you may just be saying to yourself, oh, I supervise a lot of sex therapists as well at times. And, you'd be amazed that they're saying, it's funny, it's been like 3 or 4 months and they're sort of not ready to talk about it yet. Or we're still kind of dealing with the relationship issues. They're not ready. And I got to be honest, I think that that's really saying that, not to say there aren't bigger issues, but you're kind of colluding with the couple to avoid the thing that they're having a problem talking about, hence why they came to you. And so you have to be really willing to be, out there with your machete sort of hacking through this, new jungle. And so how do I do that? One way I do it is by recognizing that sex therapy is it's a biopsychosocial paradigm. And so there's a lot of information out there, and you have to pick the areas that you want to know and specialize in and understand what you don't know, because often it will involve not just being a good therapist, not just being a good communicator and listener, but you really do have to accumulate a kind of a body of information. And then you really do have to combine that information with known behavioral interventions, but often just very intuitive, creative, spontaneous interventions that are very, very, very targeted and very customized, because it's hard work. So I can understand why a lot of therapists avoid sex therapy. But once you have the information, and once you have sort of the language of science, and once you have the courage to break the ice, you'd be amazed how people just warm up to it and want to join with you in that language. And I often also try and remember that, talking about sex doesn't have to be heavy. It doesn't have to be an ordeal. It can be sexy. It can be fun. It can be arousing, and helping the client to go home with a language that's not a therapeutic clinical language, but is actually an interpersonal, communicative, sexy language. Is part of my goal.
That's fantastic. It reminds me, the journey of being comfortable talking about it. And a bit of the message you're saying is you have to have some information and some ways to put words around these things, to get that information. I can remember when I do a lot of work with hypersexual behavior. Mm-hmm. And I remember many, many years ago when my kids were around the dinner table, and they'd bring somebody home, and for some reason we were talking about sex something or porn something or hypersexual behavior something. And the poor kid that was here visiting was like, whoa, getting all embarrassed. And then I'd catch myself like, oh yeah, and they'd say, my mom does that, So.
And how terrific, because how often have you sat down with a couple and you said, so tell me about how you were modeled to be in intimate relationships. Tell me about your early experiences. How were your parents? Were they loving? Were they sex positive? Were they intimate? And, and that's where patients just like, they draw that blank and they're like, I have no idea. I never saw anything. So I'd much rather sit at a table where mom is sort of being more provocative or opening up these conversations than not.
Well, it's a way, I think, as therapists that we can start to kind of claim some of these things and get comfortable, right? Because maybe some of us started in the therapy room, or we started with education, but we have to have the words come out of our mouth somewhere to be able to get comfortable with it and to help our clients be comfortable with it.
Absolutely, and that's where I think the information where it comes down to information. When people want to get certified as, let's say with ASECT as certified sex therapists, one of the first things you have to do is participate in what's called a SAR, which is usually a weekend long event that stands for sort of a sexual attitude readjustment, reassessment, but it's basically exposing you to so many different types of sexuality and issues that are out there. And it's really in an attempt to help the therapist locate themselves in relationship to this and expose them to it. Because look, all you have to do is open up a newspaper and you're reading about LGBTQ, non-monogamy, polyamory, sexual adventure, opening up marriages. I mean, it can feel trans issues, and it can feel like, wow, like it's just too much.
Yeah, where do we start?
You know, so I can understand why there's some fear and trepidation around the subject for clinicians.
Well, picking up some of your books is a great way to start. And as people are hearing already, some of your languaging is really comfortable and helpful. And we're getting comments in the chat about appreciating your vulnerability and, you know, some of the things that you're saying. Outer course is as important as intercourse, and clitoracy, you know, like you've picked up, you've made some great little terms and phrases that are helpful, along with using the sexual body, like the body parts. That's one of the things that I can remember in some of my first sex courses taking is, you know, you can just be comfortable using body part words, then that's okay.
Yeah. I think one of the ways I learned how to kind of get comfortable too is I've done a lot of being here in New York City. I've done a lot of media appearances on, say, like the Today Show, and it's so scrubbed down. It's so G-rated and PG-rated, so that you really just end up using really the language of science and the language that's neutral. But I think the main thing that I bring to clients is a sense of ease, a sense of comfort, and a real willingness to open up and develop the conversation.
Yeah, that's so important. That's such an important thing to do. Well, I have a question from one of our listeners.
Sure.
And that is, we'll see where it takes us. It's she says that she has a couple that are older. I think he's in his early 60s. And he wants to be spontaneous. And she wants to be scheduled. And she wondered if that's more typical of men wanting to be spontaneous.
Yes. So, you know, it's actually wonderful that you brought this up and that you use the word spontaneous. One of my colleagues, a woman named Emily Nagoski out of Smith College, she has a book out actually this month called Come As You Are. And it's a wonderful book on sort of the latest sexual science. And I encourage everyone to read it. Again, Emily Nagoski, Come As You Are. But one of the things that she talks about, which is you know, something that I've talked about a lot too, but she really puts a nice language around it, is that, you know, science has really shown us that male desire is spontaneous. Male desire can, you know, almost come out of nowhere. And really, male desire can respond to a single sexual cue. So a guy is out there and he sees a sexy woman, or he sees a sexy billboard, or he's on his computer and suddenly there's a Sports Illustrated pop-up of a woman in a bikini, and that single sexual cue really initiates the arousal system. And it's one of the reasons why for men Viagra is so successful, is that desire and arousal are so interlinked. So you send some blood to the penis gets erect, and lo and behold, desire also is part of that process, a desire to use that erection. For women, women can experience a sexual cue. They can see something sexy, they can smell something sexy, they can recognize something sexy, they can have a sexy thought, but it doesn't necessarily lead to a desire to have sex. And so one of the areas where men get so angry at women is around, why do I always initiate? Why doesn't she experience sex spontaneously the way I do? It's why am I the one that always has to step up to bat and get struck out? Well, again, the science shows us male desire is spontaneous, female desire is responsive. For female desire to be cultivated, there needs to be a context of multiple sexual cues, more than a single sexual cue, that creates a context for arousal. And so if a woman is saying, I want to schedule sex, that's really a way of saying, I want to create a context for sex. I want to mark out some time and I want to create a context for sex. And I mean, I think that men really have to get, just as with the clitoris and understanding that it's the vulva, not the vagina, men have to stop with this idea that women should be experiencing desire spontaneously like men. It's just not the way it works. What men should be thinking about doing is how to create a context of multiple sexual cues that will stimulate arousal and desire.
That's such an interesting response. You know, I guess as a woman, I'm kind of thinking about it the other, maybe a little bit of a different direction. So tell me what you think about this. I was thinking about as an older, you know, my husband and I are older, and so we have some of these conversations. And although he's never, yeah, okay, I better not, I don't have permission from him. I can talk about me. I better be careful what I say about him.
Yeah, I learned the hard way.
I know, that's right.
I talked about my wife on the Today Show, and boy, I thought, she never watches me out there on these shows. She's always somewhere, she's like, she didn't like what I was saying. Anyway.
Well, I was thinking about many of the older clients that I see as well, and this idea of spontaneity, that, you know, it's not as, there's not as much spontaneity happening in an older male. And so maybe there's something about, gosh, I just want to do it when I've got it, you know, because it's those kinds of urges and the erection and, you know, the quickness of all of that is slowing down.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, with any issue, whether it's erectile disorder or whether it's premature ejaculation or delayed ejaculation or pain during sex, whenever there's some life cycle issue or some kind of problem, you really have to develop a unique sexual script that builds around that problem. And so you do. You brought an interesting dimension. This is an older couple. Maybe the only time he gets erections is in the morning. Maybe he wakes up with one morning erection, and that's it. And maybe they've only ever really had sex on Friday nights, and you know, they have to start switching to morning sex, and they have to develop a new sex script around their changing sexuality. And you know, in all the time in my work as a sex therapist, I always in the first or second session want to talk about the last time that they had sex, and I really want to understand what was the sex script. So what led to desire? What was the context that led for desire? Okay, so how did desire start to get cultivated? What sort of activities did you engage in? How did arousal sort of start to happen? When did arousal continue to orgasm, or did it stop somewhere? What are the activities? I mean, you really want to get, you know, really close to the ground on understanding the sex script.
That's so important, thinking about assessment that way, and thinking about the sex script. When does it happen? How do they hook up? When does it happen, and what leads to it? And just going back to the question from the listener, I guess there's a couple things that you would do in your approach is understand that. Is it that she wants it scheduled and he wants to be spontaneous? Is it hard for him to, because men can also be responsive sexually if they don't have spontaneous desire, right? That's one of the things that happens with older men, is that they have to get used to the idea that, oh, if you touch me, then I can get desire, even if it didn't happen automatically. But that can maybe be a little shaming for men.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, it's also important to really take you know, sex out of the bedroom and really look at what's happening in the relationship. And, you know, is there novelty and newness and spontaneity and excitement in the relationship itself? You know, if it's not there in the relationship, it's probably going to be pretty hard to manufacture in the bedroom. The other thing that I often find with couples of all ages is that, you know, they've come to rely on a few sex scripts that they know work. Very often those sex scripts involve physical stimulation, but there isn't often a mental component to sex. There isn't a lot of fantasizing. There isn't, you know, there just isn't the creative mental stimulation. I mean, if you think about arousal, a guy, you can sit there and get an erection through doing nothing but thinking about sex or seeing something sexy or having a sexy memory, and the same for women. But why do we not engage our minds more when we're actually having sex with the person we love.
That's right. Why do we go other places? Or I remember, it must be one of the training tapes or EFT, one of the tapes where one of the clients says, you know, I want your attention. I think it's in Sue's Hold Me Tight training tape. I want to know that you're not thinking about the grocery list, you know, when we're having sex. But it's hard. I guess we're not, for some reason.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to make one more point about female sexuality, which is, and I will say, Rebecca, you're going in and out a little bit audio-wise, so I hope you can hear me okay. If you can, just give me a thumbs up, and you know, thank you. One of the things, one of the most fascinating studies that I've seen around the differences between male and female sexuality is it was done using men and women in fMRI scanning machines. Yeah. And it really was looking at like what happens in the male brain versus the female brain during sexual arousal. And in both the male and female brain, orgasm is like this fireworks festival that lights up the whole brain. But the process to getting to that fireworks festival is quite different. In men, all parts of the brain remain very active and very lit up. But in women, the closer they get to orgasm, the more aroused they get, actually parts of the brain are deactivating. And those are parts of the brain that are often associated with stress, anxiety, high emotion. And what the researcher who was done in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, concluded is that for women to really cycle through the process of arousal to orgasm, it's really about the brain. To turn a woman on, parts of the brain have to turn off. And you really have to be able to create this environment where a woman can relax and not be stressed out and really kind of deactivate and go into kind of a trance-like state. And I don't think many men, when they're thinking about foreplay or they're thinking about orgasm or they're thinking about sex, I don't think they're really thinking about how do I create an environment of safety, security, as well as an environment where she can really relax and deactivate. And that includes whatever's happening outside the bedroom as well as what's happening inside the bedroom.
That's such pivotal research for people to know about, isn't it? That the deactivation happens spontaneously with men and not with women, and that's really, really important. It reminds me of some, maybe, do you have a reference for that? I know we'll have some people that may ask that, or we can get some references later.
Yeah, the name is escaping me just at this moment.
Yeah, no problem.
I'll get it to
I'm going to cite a study too, something that I read that I'll have to go back and look up the reference to, because when you're talking about that, it reminds me of a similar study that I'll have to find the reference for, that had to do with women feeling the arousal, their body, you know, marking it, having some response to it, but it not registering as desire. And it's, you know, I think as all those other things are going on, that's just not the part that they're maybe paying attention to.
Yeah, you know, I wonder if you're really talking about some of the work of the sex researcher Rosemary Basson, Basson, who I think came up with some brilliant work, which really says for women that men can begin with desire. Desire can be spontaneous, it can happen, it could lead to arousal. In many cases for women, arousal will precede desire. So there's either some sort of physical arousal, some sort of mental arousal, maybe there's more of having to put yourself through the motions and sort of put your body through the motions and trust that your mind will sort of catch up, but that you need to generate some kind of arousal before desire manifests.
That's right. And many times that physical arousal, like it could be coded in the brain or in the physiology, like when they, I think they were studying vaginal or clitoral responses or blood flow, but the women would not identify arousal. Yeah.
It's I think the technical term is arousal discordance, and so there's sort of a disconnect between the brain and the genitals, and you know, I think that's exactly what you know, what you're talking about. It's a little bit what Emily gets into in the book Come As You Are, and it's you know, it's an important part. There was also an interesting study that asked women, you know, all the reasons you have sex, and I think that women came up with about 237 reasons why they had sex. Everything from I'm horny, I want to have sex, to it's the only way I can get him to go to sleep so I can, go read my book. But that they found that when women at least had a reason to have sex, that led to a stage of willingness, having sexual willingness. And so sometimes even just having willingness, not to say you're going to have sex or you have to have sex, but just being predisposed and having a willingness towards sex.
Yes, because if you're willing and your body's responsive and you can get in that headspace, there's safety there, then it's so likely, really, that the desire will build and there'll be a good experience. And it's an important shared experience to nurture a relationship and to increase and maintain the bond.
Yeah, I think that's why EFT and sex therapy can go together so well, because when you have that when you have that secure attachment, when you have that sense of safety with a partner, then you can really get bold and adventurous. But if you don't have the safety and the attachment, and you just have the boldness and the adventurousness, I don't think it's going to lead to lead to real pleasure. It's going to lead to spectatoring. It's going to lead to being more concerned about your performance than the actual sex that you're having.
Yeah. Yes, I just wrote a blog recently on cuddling and some of the newer research that shows that the cuddling after sex impacts the relationship. The sex is great, but the cuddling after tends to have a big impact.
Yeah, and men like to cuddle too. I mean, I think very often, men get a bad rap. You look at male sexuality and it's like the on-off switch, and then you look at female sexuality and it's all the knobs and dials. And I think that those are both sort of, gross stereotypes. But I really deal with so many men who are either struggling with low desire and low libido, or they're in a sex rut and they feel so emotionally disconnected. And sex is such a conduit for an emotional connection, and that's what they're longing for.
Yes, and that holding afterwards is so important to both. Okay, I have a couple other questions.
Sure.
One has to do with when there's painful intercourse. I guess, what are your suggestions around that when there is painful intercourse?
Well, it's important to sort of try and locate the pain and diagnose the pain. Is it situational? Is it chronic? Has there been any kind of lifestyle change? Is there increased stress or anxiety? There are a lot of things that could affect lubrication, which would ultimately cause the tearing of membranes and would cause pain. I mean, certainly you have to be able to open up a conversation with your partner about it. You may have to rely on outer course more than intercourse. It may be ample time to introduce lubrication, introduce a lubricant into your sex menu. It may be, for women, it could be perimenopause or menopause. There's a lot of reasons, and I think at the heart of it is just going to be a good assessment, communication, and probably changing the sex script to accommodate it. I think the problem is that many women will just sort of bear it in order to continue having sex as is, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah. So you said this really great term that I'd love you to expound on when you talk about the sex menu. Can you add some other things that may be in people's sex menus?
Yeah, I mean, the sex menu is a fun concept. I think Susanna Iasenza, who's going to be at the conference, I'm so excited, at the June Sex and Attachment Conference. She wrote a wonderful article about sex menus, and just basically how if you look at the sex that you're having right now with your partner and you think about it as a menu that includes appetizers, entrees, and dessert, it may be a single item menu, it may be a 3-item menu, and it's very likely the menu that you're always, consuming from. And so the idea of sitting down with a couple and having them fantasize about a sex menu and then sharing that with their partner, that can be a great way to develop a new sex script. I also talk about, similar to sex menus, I kind of liken sex to the food pyramid, where we have these different food groups: carbohydrates, protein, and I think that there are different types of, just as there are different food groups, there are different types of sex that we can really indulge in. There's sex that is all about intimacy and emotional connection and lovemaking, and you think of somebody like David Schnarch, who talks about eyes staring at the partner through orgasm.
Wall socket, mind-blowing sex, right?
Yeah. But there's lovemaking. I think that there's also, sometimes there's just stress-relieving sex, whether it's quick and functional and orgasmic, or it's self-stimulation, but it's sort of orgasm for the sake of orgasm, sex for the sake of sex. Then, of course, there's the sex that I think is my favorite category, which is the sex that involves fantasizing and using your imaginations and bringing in different forms of erotic stimulation, and the sex that really opens up, gets all the neurons really firing. And then I think there's different types of sensual sex that appeal to each of the senses: sight, sound, touch, taste, smell. And when you're thinking about your sex menu, think about, just as you think about the food groups for a real menu, think about these sex groups for your sex menu. And you can come up with a variety of different sex menus. I actually do have an ebook on my website, goodinbed.com, and it's called 52 Weeks of Amazing Sex. And it's this idea that couples in loving, satisfying relationships should make an effort to try to have sex once a week. I hate to try and give couples a number. I mean, everyone always says, how often should I have sex? But I like to say, try to have sex a minimum of once a week if you can. And it's not just the quantity, it's also the type of sex you're having. And so I wrote this book, 52 Weeks of Amazing Sex, with the idea of, here's 52 different types of sex, or different exercises, or different fun activities that you can engage in that pull from each of those groups.
That's really fun. The website, I'm glad you mentioned the website as well, and the book, the 52 Weeks, and that add that newness and that freshness and that exploration that a couple can bring into their relationship, especially when they have that safe, kind of that secure base to go off of. When, coming from emotionally focused therapy perspective, and Sue Johnson talks in her book about Hold Me Tight, and she mentions a few different types of attachment style approaches to the sexual relationship. And it's a mini menu, really, in some ways. But when you're secure, you can do those other kinds of sex. You can do sex for comfort. You can do sex for play. You can do sex just to please your partner. You might be able to do those if your main base is we do have sex for bonding and for closeness and to really stay connected to each other.
Absolutely. And I also want to say, don't discount the sex that you're having regularly that works. Like, sometimes people feel compulsion to always be new or novel or to be doing something different. But, whenever you're learning something new, you're tasking your prefrontal cortex to learn a new routine, to learn a new activity. And really, to achieve the deactivation that we talked about, you really need to go to a place that's kind of unconscious, where these routines are sort of already embedded. So do not discount in any way the comfort sex, the sex that's working.
That's
I think the challenge is, how do you integrate those comfortable scripts with elements that are new? And that's what I work on with a lot of my couples.
Yeah, because if you have the comfort as the base, and you're integrating new scripts and new things along the way, you have that security that you can do something new without shutting down arousal, because fear and arousal don't mix very well.
Yeah. I think it's so important to be able to share a fantasy with your partner, to be able to tell your partner, you have this, I had this sexy dream about you, or I was remembering this time we had sex, and that, to get to that point where you can share that with your partner, just say those words, I had a fantasy about you, you really do need that security, safety, and comfort that comes from a really strong, secure attachment.
Lovely to hear you say that. So let's see some other questions from our listeners.
Okay.
How about if you have where would you go in assessment is the question. What would be your next phase or place you would go in assessment if a female partner says that when she or her husband plays with her clitoris that it doesn't feel good at all for her and it just feels awkward? You know, what would you think that means, or where would you go in assessment after that?
Well, I mean, I would certainly want to focus on what feels good, what activities is she comfortable with, what does she enjoy? I think I would, with a woman, you know, I mean, I don't think that you can really like avoid the clitoris in terms of achieving sexual pleasure. I mean, the clitoris is, I mean, unequivocally, scientifically, it's the powerhouse of the female orgasm. I mean, even if you have a G-spot orgasm or a cervical orgasm, whether you want to squirt or ejaculate or whatever kind of orgasm you want to have, the clitoris is really going to be very crucially involved at the center of that experience. So I would not like work with a woman who doesn't enjoy clitoral pleasure and say, well, let's just forget about the clitoris altogether. I mean, in some ways, we really have to figure out, you know, what's going on. And I would probably go back to, I'd probably ask this couple to take clitoral stimulation off the table for a little while, to maybe take sex off the table. I mean, we haven't really addressed this dimension, but sometimes you really do have to sort of take the pressure of sex sort of outside of the room and just let couples begin again from a kind of a fertile ground zero. And in this case, I might really go to self-pleasure and masturbation and work with this woman on exercises that she could do to achieve a level of clitoral comfort on her own, and work through pushing through past her sort of small comfort zone and getting her to expand that zone and to kind of help her to enjoy her own clitoris and her own sexuality, and then to be able to bring that to her partner.
It'd be so interesting just to see what those scripts are for her, or what's going on in her head, you know, what's happening when that discomfort, what else is going on there?
Yeah, I mean, you know, so she's uncomfortable with clitoral stimulation. It may be because she hasn't gotten a lot of it, and so she's feeling aroused, and those feelings of arousal are new or strange. It could be that when she's being clitorally stimulated, it's during oral sex, and she's uncomfortable with the vulnerability of oral sex or being seen, tasted, smelled. It could be during some kind of manual stimulation. Who knows? I mean, there could be a whole sort of relational context for why the clitoral stimulation is uncomfortable. And that's where you guys, sex therapy, I swear, it's like really like detective work. It's really like being like, you got to be like a very curious Sherlock Holmes to kind of figure it out. And you have to be creative, and you have to establish the kind of trust where you can ask somebody to do an assignment that they may be uncomfortable with, and it may not work, but it'll provide more information.
So they can take some risks with you and with their sexuality, with their partner. Okay, another quick question. Thanks for that. What book would you recommend? Is there any particular book you would recommend of your own or someone else's if one partner is still triggered by a previous rape?
Yeah, so I mean, I know Sue Johnson has done a lot of work on sexual trauma. Isn't that right, Rebecca? I mean, you know,
with working with trauma, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly read some of her academic articles.
Yeah.
There's some work happening. Wendy Maltz's Sexual Healing is an older book, but a good book.
Really good book.
Yeah. There's some work happening out of Israel by two researchers and therapists, Nassim, N-A-S-I-M, and Nadam, N-A-D-A-M, and they're integrating trauma therapy into couples therapy and also using narrative therapy, and the idea of both the therapist and the relational partner being witnesses in sort of a new way and a new context of witnessing. So I've used some of their work clinically when I'm working with sexual trauma in a relationship. But I would say for a consumer to go out there and get a book, I would look at, I would look maybe to the Maltz book.
Yeah. Wendy's, her material is really great. It would be really helpful with that. Okay, let's see. A couple other questions. Really nice that we're having questions come in. So Sophia says she's thinking of a male client who feels so hurt by the lack of a female's partner's interest, and the hurt is real. She's really grateful that you're saying that some guys get a bad rap in the sexual arena because his hurt comes out in frustration and blame. And so his female partner doesn't feel safe then, so doesn't want to get close physically or sexually.
Yeah.
How might we help the male partner soften around his hurt?
Well, I mean, I have a thought, but then I'm going to really hand that over to you because I've been really impressed whenever I've seen EFT therapists. I've worked with Zoya here in New York, and I mean, I think EFT is obviously great at getting to those primary emotions and to those vulnerabilities beneath the secondary emotions. And so I think that just requires good couples therapy. But, you know, similarly, you know, I've had situations where, let's say, after a new baby is born and there hasn't been sex in the relationship for the 3rd trimester and sometimes for 8 weeks to follow. And now mom's putting so much energy into the baby, and that's such a key emotional relationship. And guys get really frustrated around the sex part. And I always it's really sort of paradoxical because I really admire the energy, because in some ways they're saying, hey, to make this thing work, this baby, this marriage, this relationship, you need to rejoin the dyad with me.
That's right.
So in pushing you to have sex and being grumpy and saying we never have sex, and you know, I'm really trying to pull you back into something that's essential for the system, for our family system. But you're doing it in absolutely the wrong way. Yeah. And so the energy is to be applauded, because if that guy doesn't have that energy, then what's going to happen? That's right. Two couples are going to go their separate. Two people are going to go their separate ways.
Right. Yeah, we would put that protest, you know, protesting for connection and protesting for partnership, and and then, as you say, get underneath to that vulnerability so he can express hurt and fear rather than having it come out in anger. But the energy is fantastic, isn't it? Yeah. So helpful to have that.
Yeah, I just did this. I mean, this is the kind of stuff you do all the time, but I was just working with a couple, and she's out literally like 4 nights a week working all night. And so he only gets her like 1 or 2 nights a week. And the whole time he's really just complaining. And then finally he just said, I miss you. I miss you. And on those 2 nights when you're home, I just want you because I've missed you so much. And for her, just hearing that reframe, instead of hearing the criticism, just hearing I miss you, she just said, I've never heard you say that.
Right. Changes the context completely when you talk about context, you know, for the sexual relationship. Okay, one more question that's come in, and it has to do with a lesbian couple where one of the partners has no desire and no interest, and it's an issue between them. And that's not really too uncommon in lesbian couples. We hear about dead bed, right? So what would you say about that?
You know, the term lesbian bed death. And, you know, I definitely, I work with a lot of lesbian couples. And, you know, I think I may kind of come back to that idea of spontaneous versus, you know, responsive desire, and that it's a bit of a generalization, but in general, men experience spontaneous desire and will often initiate. And so what happens if you have 2 women who both are experiencing responsive desire? Where is the initiation? Where is the...
Who's going to fight for that? Yeah.
Right. Where is that spontaneous desire. And so I think and this would be true for a heterosexual couple, like the one you described, where the male desire is less spontaneous and more responsive. You really have to work much harder to cultivate an environment of different types of sexual cues, and you have to think much harder about sculpting and sort of architecting your sex life. So I don't have like beyond saying well, what is the current sex script and what could you be doing differently and what are the exceptions, and sort of building from the ground up. I don't think that there's really any difference in working with an LGBTQ couple versus a heterosexual couple.
That's right.
Except when you may end up more likely having two people who have responsive versus spontaneous desire.
Yeah, or well, in this situation, one does have high desire and one doesn't. So it's the kind of the same issue that often heterosexual couples experience, where that context and that safety and creating those same sort of things, right, apply. And it's certainly, there's also so many heterosexual relationships that are sexless.
Yeah, and I sometimes tell people to take a sort of a try it, you'll like it approach. If you let your body lead and trust that your mind will follow. I can't tell you how many couples have just come back after having sex and said, God, that was actually easy and fun, and I forgot how much I kind of liked it. And, sex ruts beget sex ruts. That's why I always tell couples to try and have sex once a week, because if it's not once a week, then it's going to be every other week. And if it's not every other week, it's going to be every 3 weeks. And then pretty soon you can't remember the last time you had sex. And you know what? You're no longer eroticized. You no longer have a memory of sex. Testosterone levels have gone down. Sex ruts beget sex ruts. Now, sometimes you need to go back to masturbation. It's a myth that that if you masturbate, it's going to take away from your libido. Certainly in some cases, over masturbation will lead to a depletion of libido. But in general, healthy eroticized couples, healthy eroticized people also masturbate. So for this lesbian couple, I may say this is an opportunity for some self-indulgence and for some self-love. I think also you also have to always remember, are you really turning on the mental component of sex? Are you introducing fantasy? Are you creating that context of deactivation?
Sometimes in my work with couples, sometimes I think I've seen where a long history of not enjoying sex or having a partner that knew how to pleasure pleasure the female partner, that can lead to this view, or this identity development about I'm not a sexy person, or I just don't enjoy sex. And so we really have to have new experiences that will kind of open that up a little bit.
Absolutely, and orgasm is an incredible reward mechanism, and it this is my own personal peeve. You may disagree with me, people out there may disagree with me, but I hate when therapists and the media sort of say, oh, for men it's very important to have orgasms, but women, just the experience of sex can be enough, and the orgasm doesn't really matter. It's like, not to say that the experience of sex can't be fun or enriching, but let's be honest, men and women, we enjoy orgasms equally alike. It's just that
it's frustrating. It's frustrating also for a woman to stop when she's aroused and not having an orgasm.
Absolutely, and it's just that women tend to statistically have them much less frequently because of this arousal gap, because of this ill cliteracy, and as a result, we've developed this whole language around the idea that orgasms don't matter as much for women, and it's just total poppycock.
So we're not going to be dismissing or discounting that anymore.
Good sex is the best motivation to have more sex.
Yeah, so sex ruts beget more sex ruts, and good sex begets better sex and more good sex.
Absolutely.
Well, it's just been so delightful to have you on the show. Since you've been scheduled, I've been saying things. I'll often sign off or write things like, oh, I'm so excited. And then I've noticed myself being self-conscious, like, oh, I've got the sex talk coming up. I don't know if I want to say I'm being so excited or not.
You know what my sign off is, Rebecca? Viva la vulva. That's what I always say, Viva la vulva, whenever I'm signing off. Even on the Today Show, I say Viva la vulva. It was fun. It was a pleasure. I'm looking forward to seeing you at the Sex and Attachment Conference in New York. I'm going to be moderating some panels there with you. And
Yes.
so I look forward to all the great thinking and work that's coming out of the EFT community around sex and attachment.
Yeah, really appreciate you being here with us, and it will be great to see you in New York. And I want to encourage our listeners to look up your books. She Comes First is a great one to read and to pass around, and for females too. I think, to read it, for me, when I read it, I thought, this is so great because it's so validating, and it's so like, oh, somebody really understands and can help men understand. It's just really fantastic. So Viva la vulva, great, so much. So wonderful to have you on with us, Ian. Thanks so much.
Thank you. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone. See you next month.